Awesome. So thanks for the introduction and thanks to everyone who's listening right now. Um, it's pretty cool. Scott Taylor's online here. Him and I grew up fishing together in Edmonton area when we were kids, so that's kind of cool to see him again. Um, this actually feels like a group that's exactly perfect in terms of audience for sharing the kind of work that we've been doing in the Upper Oldman. Um, A lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight sort of lives at the intersection of science, place, and people who care deeply about things like rivers and fish and landscapes. And I know most of you bring your own sort of lived understanding of places like the Upper Old Man. I just see this as a really good opportunity to share what we can from a science and monitoring perspective and put that information into a broader shared context. Um, and yeah, I'll start just by giving a bit of a outline. So I'll begin by introducing the Upper Man study area and kind of why it's important. I'll go over some of the historic highlights and trends from the watershed in terms of the wreck fishery up here. Um, talk a little bit about how much angling actually occurs in the watershed. And I'll explain how we started evaluating West Slopes in the Upper Old Man and what our time series data results currently look like. And then I'll go into the effects of catch and release regulations and the incidence of hooking damage on West Slopes in the Upper Old Man, kind of saving the best for last, at least in my opinion. So I'll start by giving an overview of the area we call the Upper Old Man. This is where it's located in the province. It's in southwest corner. When I say Upper Old Man, what I really mean is the Livingston and Oldman River watersheds above the Gap Falls. The Gap Falls represents kind of the de facto bottom end of our study area where we've worked on and off over the past 20 years or more. Most recently, our focus has been in this red shaded part up above the confluence with the Oldman and Livingston rivers. Um, we've done comprehensive work across the whole watershed since early 2000s. Um, Key streams and rivers include the Old Man and Livingston, of course, Hidden Creek, which is a major bull trout spawning tributary to the Old Man, as well as Dutch Creek and Racehorse Creek and its main tributaries, which are Vickery and Daisy Creeks. And if you've traveled down the trunk road, you've probably seen all of these. Also of note, there are these five watersheds sort of sandwiched between the Old Man and the Livingston rivers along Cabin Ridge. You might have heard that name before. Anyway, these are confirmed fishless watersheds because of waterfall barriers that impede fish migration. Um, I just put this on here because when you see where our sampling locations are, you might notice that there's an empty space there. That's just because these watersheds are naturally fishless. The importance of the watershed as a whole with respect to West Slope persistence, survival, and recovery, I don't think it can be overstated. Westslope cutthroat are listed federally as threatened in Alberta, and this area represents the largest remaining intact population of genetically uncompromised Westslope in our province. And this figure is from the federal Westslope Cutthroat Trout Recovery Strategy and Action Plan from DFO and Species at Risk. The areas colored in pink here are considered critical habitat, and they roughly align with the current areas of known genetically pure West Slope cutthroat, which is greater than or equal to 99% pure West Slope cutthroat trout genetics. Also important is that there are no brook trout in this watershed. Adding to the importance of this watershed are these two circles here, which is where the vast majority of the West Slope gametes were taken by GOA and other members of the Native Trout Collaborative to develop our provincial recovery stocking Westslope broodstock. You can see it's kind of shaping up to be a fairly important piece of landscape. And part of the reason it's such a good stronghold for West Slopes is due in part to some natural waterfall barriers that prevent invasion from things like rainbow trout, which hybridize with cutthroat. And also one of the reasons is, like I mentioned before, there's no brook trout here, which are competitors. And just south of us in the Crow's Nest watershed, brook trout are pervasive in most of the tributaries and in the river itself. But here, there are none. And that in itself is a pretty key difference between this watershed and some of the other West Slope critical habitat areas, say in the Bow system, which are nearly all occupied by invasive brook trout. So this is Gap Falls, as I mentioned earlier. It marks the lower end of the study area. This is how it appears in the summer. It's a very popular fishing spot. When you drive by the parking lot, there's always a ton of vehicles there. And it's also a fairly effective fish barrier depending on the time of year. It restricts movement of local invasives like downstream rainbow trout, but it doesn't completely prevent them. Here it is again in the late fall. You can see it's beginning to freeze over. It looks pretty formidable at this stage, but during the spring freshet, it's way less formidable to fish, which can and do ascend it. The arrow there kind of identifies what I would consider a functional pathway for most fish could probably ascend. And rainbows do inhabit the upper watershed above this, albeit in fewer numbers than below. Uh, but there is hybridization between cutthroat and rainbows in the upper watershed, which is a key threat to west slopes. Uh, Another interesting thing is bull trout routinely navigate through this waterfall as well when the conditions are right, kind of like in this photo. This is actually kind of important that they can pass because it connects the Oldman with the Castle and Lower Crow's Nest populations of bull trout. Um, and if you've ever fished these falls during the summer, you've probably observed bull trout trying to leap the waterfall, even when it's not really possible at that time of year. This photo's in 2017, which was not really a particularly high freshet year, but you can see even during a fairly average year, that pathway is there right up the middle. And this is just it again from above. Looks more like a speed bump than a barrier, and it just shows good perspective of how a waterfall can become inundated at higher flows. Um, it's not a totally reliable barrier to prevent invasion, but it definitely does reduce the flow of invasive rainbow trout going upstream. A second really important barrier is this one located in the upper part of the Oldman River, what's locally called the Northwest Branch. These upper falls are smack in the middle of that largest patch of critical habitat area from the recovery strategy on the map. Um, it's an impassable waterfall barrier that protects pure stocks of west slopes above it, and it's located in the Beehive Natural Area. It's by the parking area. You've probably seen the signs if you've driven up there. Above this waterfall, there is no other species of fish except pure west slopes. Um, the upstream watershed area is also a key uh, conservation area for west slope genetics in Alberta. And since I brought it up earlier, even though Racehorse Creek isn't part of the study area we're currently working in, these are the two other key waterfall barriers in the Racehorse Creek watershed that prevent invasives from entering that lower circle area that I mentioned earlier. So South and North Racehorse each have a pretty good waterfall barrier that sort of keep West Slope from being hybridized. So that was the study area. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the recreational fishery since that's where you guys all come in and why most of us bios got into this line of work in the first place. The cover slide was from the Oldman, so I figured I should add the Livingston as well. This is a shot somewhere in the middle Livingston. Um, Generally speaking, you could argue The Upper Oldman and Livingston rivers are among the premier trout fishing streams in Alberta. I think that's a pretty easy given, I think. Um, when it comes to a wading experience, fly fishing for native trout and West Slopes in particular, you could arguably rank this place near the top of anywhere in North America in terms of good catch rates and size of native West Slopes. And this is based on comments I've heard from like visitors we encounter out there. Folks from Ontario, we've spoken to guides and other anglers from BC, and then professional colleagues from the US. Um, it's just interesting to get outside perspectives. For example, when we hosted the first Canadian venue of the annual Bull Trout Conference at CCS in 2009, our American counterparts were asking about, where's a good place to go fly fishing as part of my trip up north. And so I just told them, what everyone in Alberta already knows, go to the Upper Oldman. But when they got back to me afterwards, they were basically dumbfounded by the number and size of cuts they were catching. And I think the exact words were, we've never caught so many big, beautiful Westslope cutthroat trout. And these are guys, that live and work in places like Montana. So, not surprisingly, this system is also very important to Alberta anglers, and as a result, it sees considerable angling effort. The importance of the wreck fishery is demonstrated by the angling effort it historically received and continues to receive from Alberta anglers, who overwhelmingly constitute the majority of its users. The fact is, this is not a secret watershed. Fishing for West Slope cutthroat and the Oldman in general has long been a popular activity for Albertans. We all like these old photos of big catches of fish from the Glenbow archives. In this case, one says Fort Macleod area, but you can see the catch they had there. The top one there, I'm convinced, is on Racehorse Creek just before it enters the Oldman main stem. That's from the 1910s. And then, of course, there's this photo of the Livingston River from 1956, um, where they're driving cattle across the river. And if you know the river, it really hasn't changed all that much uh, compared to when this picture was taken. Although they don't drive their cattle through there as much. Um, and besides making, fly fishermen and biologists cringe, there's a purpose for this photo. I kind of think it might reflect what some of the philosophy was of stakeholders and managers between the 1950s and 70s. So beginning in 1954, we can see there was this rotational angling closure strategy in the Upper Oldman, um, which occurred up until 1970. It looks something like an alternate year grazing schedule, almost. Like I said earlier, maybe shows the influence of local stakeholders at that time, namely ranchers. It also shows that as early as 1954, there's a realization that something needs to be done to regulate angling in the Oldman. Uh, this is, likely harvest angling during this period, but I still think it's kind of significant. And then I just like these sport fishing rigs that found online. By 1976, West Slopes have made it to the cover of the fishing rigs, and they're definitely in the public consciousness in Alberta, you know, when I was one. I think context is important, so I've included these charts. Starting in 1971 is when the government began recording annual license sales in the province. This chart just shows the blue line here represents resident license sales, and the orange line represents the Alberta human population. So, contrary to what it might seem like, the number of anglers aren't there is not necessarily increasing. Um, Generally speaking, there was a peak in the mid 1980s when license sales kind of plateaued. And then for the past 30 years, it's kind of stayed the same, with the exception of a blip during the COVID years, the COVID year, which roughly aligned with 1988 license. sales. As a side note, one of the concerning things for us is that this human population continues to grow exponentially while the number of anglers tends to stay relatively constant. It's kind of a paradox. You might think, okay, this is good. It prevents overfishing, especially, places like the Upper Oldman. However, these diverging lines also mean that potentially a smaller proportion of Albertans are going to care about fishing and fish habitat. So just hang on to that thought uh, for a little while as we go through the rest of the presentation. These are the angler surveys that were conducted in the Oldman over that period since GOA began recording license sales. Um, the angler survey methods used between years diverge considerably and makes it kind of difficult to compare between years. And the methods, they were different, but I gave it a shot just for illustration to show, angling's been going on for quite a while in the Upper Oldman. If we made an assumption that license sales equate to angling effort, you could almost have a case if you looked at Dutch Creek, for example, notwithstanding the differences in methods. If you just hold your nose and kind of, you know, look to how the number of angling license sales align with the angler effort on the bottom bars there, it sort of looks like it tracks. Um, that black bar there is just representing a correction factor because not every year uh, surveyed the same duration. If you look at the Oldman River, it seems a little less convincing, right? It might follow it for a while, but all of a sudden, when we changed our methods in 2018, it spikes and doesn't seem quite as convincing that you could make that assumption. And then for the Livingston, it just appears to get increasingly busier, despite what the license sales were telling us. One of the key difference, I think, is the implementation of catch and release regs in 1995. That was a adaptive management experiment by GOA using catch and release that just kind of stayed. Um, so basically, make no mistake, the Oldman's been a busy angling destination for a long time. And in that 1992 chart there, my regional manager told me a story about when he was doing an angler survey in 1992, and they spoke to over 100 anglers in one day just on the northwest branch of the Oldman. When flipping through these old angling reports, I came across a couple of interesting trends in the Upper Oldman. For example, in 1992, a small majority of anglers were practicing catch and release, meaning they released harvest-sized fish instead of keeping them. I believe it was like 25 centimeters back then. By 2004, anglers were almost entirely catch and release um, in the Upper Oldman. That's 9 years prior to the critical habitat order issued by DFO in 2013 for a range-wide catch and release regulation for Westslopes. And then, of course, 2013, it's catch and release in the regulations. Another interesting trend, I thought, is that fly fishing has also become the dominant angling method in the Upper Oldman, sort of paralleling the catch and release trends we saw. A small majority, again, of anglers were fly fishers, so 53-ish to 56% by 1992, three-quarters by 2000, and overwhelmingly fly fishers dominated by 2018 when we did our angler survey. We still see, various angling methods out there for sure, but fly fishing is by far the dominant method in the Upper Oldman. So, where does the Upper Oldman rank with regards to angling effort in the province? We've talked about how often it gets fished and how long it's been fished for. Based on the most recent aerial angler counts that ACA conducted between 2016 and 2019, the highest estimated angling effort in the province per stream kilometer was in the Upper Oldman River. So ACA, we assessed all these watersheds up and down the east slopes from the Wapiti River down to the Oldman, and the Oldman far exceeded its next most popular river, which is the Highwood, and the Highwood sits right in Calgary's backyard. So even despite its close proximity to a major urban center, even the Highwood didn't receive nearly as much angling effort as the Upper Oldman did per stream kilometer. Broken down into the different flight strata from that survey, we can see every single stratum that was flown in the Upper Oldman received higher angling effort per kilometer than the other watersheds that were surveyed. Um, the Middle Oldman in particular, so it's a 13-kilometer reach from the confluence of the two rivers down to Gap Falls. That section exceeds even the Lower Bow, which is often considered somewhat of a benchmark for angling effort on Alberta rivers, and that was flown by GOA in 2021. So based on this 2018 survey, those anglers were overwhelmingly Albertans and fly fishers both, representing more than 90% of the anglers. BC, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and other represented the remaining 9%. And in terms of Alberta residents, about half were Calgarians. Other kind of represented that other 16% chunk. It was a mix of from all over the place. And interestingly, nearly 7% came from Edmonton, so that's you guys, which is even more than came from Lethbridge, down here at 5.9%. Area locals represented only 3% of the anglers, and I believe that included the MD of Ranch Lands and the municipality of Crow's Nest Pass. I just find this an interesting side note in terms of which voices represent this particular study area when it comes to proposed land use activities, etc. And I'll just leave that one at that. So this brings us to our monitoring work, or evaluations, as we like to call it. Um, this is where our worlds have likely collided out there. So if we've encountered each other up on the river, that's likely what we were up to. I know we've ran into a few of you guys on your annual fishing trips. We may have been huddled around these buckets, processing fish and measuring them before releasing them back to the river. Maybe we were backpack electrofishing, as some streams warrant kind of a smaller backpack electrofishing unit, depending on flow volume versus the larger tote barge e-fisher that we use. We might have been in the act of, you know, violations of fish privacy with our tote barge electrofisher. It's a larger unit. It's perfectly suited to the Oldman and the Livingston River main stems based on their size and stream flow, and it's very effective at capturing the larger sized fish. Or we might have just been marching downstream on the river in between our electrofishing sites, probably floating right through your favorite pool while you're trying to fish. We encounter a lot of anglers out there, and it's a PR opportunity every time we have a chance to talk to some anglers. Finally, you might have been watching us, performing various indignities to some of these beautiful looking fish. And you're probably asking, so why and what are we doing this for? And again, to answer that question, I sort of have to go back in time. For all intents and purposes, assessment of Westslope and the Oldman really took off in 2006. By that time, the impacts of hybridization, habitat loss, they were well-established threats to Westslope in Alberta, and we foresaw the importance of this particular Oldman population for their conservation. The early to mid 2000s marked a shift toward more comprehensive watershed assessments to get a holistic understanding of species at risk, which inhabit these watersheds. And our focus 20 years ago was simply to, get Westslope abundance and stock assessment for the Upper Oldman. Um, to obtain something reasonably accurate by way of an estimate at the watershed scale was still kind of novel. But we soon found out it required a ton of effort, time, and resources just to complete one. It took us 124 electrofishing sites, a dozen mark recapture, abundance estimates, 50 kilometers of electrofishing, 2 summers to complete the work, not to mention handling nearly 10,000 Westslope, or the data entry, analysis, and reporting, which also took several months. And what this gives us was a ballpark figure of total fish, juvenile abundance, and adult abundance for the whole watershed. So one place at one point in time. And you see the numbers there, they're just these big numbers. Um, from a species at risk standpoint, it provided a ton of important information for the recovery planning and stuff. And we as an organization also gained a ton of value added information, as you will see later. But from a monitoring perspective, it was a single snapshot in time and essentially one point on a chart, which told us very little about population trends or status. And so the typical question we receive when we're out there is, how are they doing? How are the fish doing? And all I could say back then was, seems like there's lots. There's nearly 300,000. Is that good? I have no idea. And that's why we need time series data sets. It isn't flashy work. It isn't feel-good work like restoration or recovery projects, but it's important information if you want to know anything meaningful about population status or trends. However, it's very costly and resource intensive and difficult to commit to, especially given how many other important fisheries priorities there are from stakeholders across Alberta. But if there is one watershed worth investing in from a stakeholder standpoint and a conservation standpoint, is definitely the Upper Oldman. It's a Westslope stronghold. So in 2018, we felt it was time to revisit the Upper Oldman and commit to a time series data collection. Incidentally, that's the same year we flew the angler count surveys that you saw earlier. Part of this timing had to do with the new land use designation, the Livingston Porcupine Hills Public Land Use Zone, and to potentially capture any changes that might result from that designation on the fishery. However, we were mostly interested in simply getting a better handle on things like interannual abundance variation from the time series, something we had never, uh, something that's never been assessed before and hasn't been available to provide context to previous snapshot assessments conducted through the province. However, as I mentioned, it's resource intensive, and even though we reduced our sampling to a much smaller doable subset of sites, 30 to 39 sites, I will tell you it was still a full program-wide effort to complete it annually over 5 years. Anyway, this is a summary of the results by Huck 10 watershed over those 5 years. This is for the tributaries only. I'll get to the main stems later. So a small picture begins to emerge regarding interannual variation. This is for the Oldman River. Uh, and juveniles, for example, bounced up and down somewhere between 15 to 35 fish per 300 meters. That's from our catch. So 15 to 35 in our electrofishing catch. Um, adults fluctuated, um, but the trend seems to be sort of a decreasing one, except for 2020, which was a weird year because of COVID. We didn't get to all of our sites that year. On the Livingston, juveniles appear to increase from 30 to 55 fish per 300 meters in our catch, um, whereas the adults seem to stabilize around 5 fish per 300 meters in our catch. Hidden Creek, this is a bull trout spawning and rearing stream with considerable bull trout out migrations of juvenile and subadult fish, which like to eat other fish. Um, so maybe that's why it's so low for Westslope, or maybe Westslope bottomed out years ago and we just didn't detect it. We don't know. Um, the adults are higher than juveniles, likely as a result of migration from the Oldman River. Juveniles will seldom make upstream journeys, so those fish that were in there are likely the juvenile fish are likely residents, and the old adults likely came up from the mouth of Hidden Creek. Then we see Dutch Creek here. Maybe something similar to Hidden. Can't really say a whole lot, except it seems to bounce between the same 2 to 15 fish per 300 meters. In terms of time series, these tell us maybe more about, you know, in between watershed abundances than within watershed changes. Here are the monitoring results for the main stem since 2018. Here we have 7 years because we have committed to the main stems for another 5 year interval, which I will explain later. This is for the Oldman River. I think we still need a couple or 3 more years to make any real assertions about what the population is doing. It seems like adult numbers on the top there were sort of stable prior to 2022, but have dipped in recent years. I would reserve judgment, however, on that until I see another couple years worth of data or consecutive low numbers because these things really bounce around. Juvenile abundance is not typically used in abundance monitoring due to the high variability of juveniles, and I think this illustrates that pretty well. You can see 2022 is off the chart. 108 fish per 500 meters versus every other year, which were lower than 40 fish. Um, I remember that year there was a big spike in recruitment when there's one upper site in the Oldman, and we caught well over 400 juveniles in 500 meters. But as you can see, it plateaus again. 2024 and 25 are almost identical. The Livingston seems fairly steady Eddie, right? Lower abundance for sure than the Oldman, but less variable. We probably have a decent picture in the Livingston already, but nonetheless, we're going to push through until at least 2028 with our surveys. Um, maybe maybe it's slow decline. It's hard to say. For juveniles, it looks like a slow increase, but that's hard to say too. Um, that's why we need more points. For the record, this is among the largest time series data sets in our province. Anything more than 5 years of consecutive data in Alberta is very rare for the reasons I mentioned earlier. And it's the only Westslope time series that we have, as far as I know. There are other examples in the province. I can think of Tri Creek, southwest of Hinton, for Athabasca rainbows, Smith Dorian, K Lakes for bull trout, Fall Creek, and the Clearwater River. Those are in Mike Roedke's backyard. Those are also bull trout uh, watersheds. But as far as Westslope go, pretty sure this is the only one. And that brings me to what I feel is the most interesting part of the talk, if you're still with me. um, and that is investigating vulnerability of Westslope cutthroat trout to angling and hooking damage. And it's among the really cool things we learned from the 5 year data set and our past watershed assessment back in 2006. In 2006, when we first electrofished the main stems with the tope barge, we produced these results that famously illustrate a truncated population structure in the then allowable harvest Oldman on top versus a more extended population structure in the Livingston, which had been catch and release since 1995. One thing we noticed immediately when we began electrofishing these main stems was the occurrence of hooking damage on so many fish. In fact, we immediately began recording it because it was so pervasive from our very first transect. And so now we have this added piece of information that tells us how many fish and what size of fish have been previously angled. The light brown here indicates the proportion of those fish in our electrofishing catch that had hooking damage. In the allowable harvest upper Oldman, not only was there fewer fish above the harvest size restriction, but proportionally fewer had hooking damage, which kind of jives with the regulations and the assumption that people were still harvesting fish in the Oldman, which had an allowable harvest. Of note is that it wouldn't have taken much of a harvest to have this impact. We compared, anglers from our 2004 creel to our 2006 relative abundance estimates, and we estimated there was more than twice as many anglers than legal-sized fish in the Oldman, and more than 5 times more anglers than legal-sized fish in the Livingston. And overall catch rates back then far exceeded what was available for harvest, which suggested a high level of voluntary catch and release was actually going on, just like the 2004 angler creel suggested when anglers were saying, yeah, 74% of us are practicing catch and release. And also, there was a high level of recycling of released fish. And that was actually a key recommendation we made from our final stock assessment report in 2008 was that catch and release regulations should be implemented across the board in the Upper Oldman. Of note here too is that we can potentially see at what size Westslope are vulnerable to hooking damage, which in 2006 begins at about 180 millimeters or 7 inches. Of course, this all depends on an assumption that smaller fish haven't simply died from being angled and, aren't showing up in our catch, but that's an assumption. If we fast forward a generation, so the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, COSEWIC, evaluates trends over the scale of generations, not years. For Westslope, it's 15 years. So we're kind of right in the ballpark to compare 2 generations here. If we look to the present, we can see the fruits of past drainage-wide catch and release regulations, where fish over 30 centimeters represent a much greater proportion of both river populations, and the overall size range of those populations extends to larger fish too. In addition, the proportion of those larger fish that are hook damaged has also increased. One of the confirmations that more of those fish are being released nowadays compared to what we saw in 2006 in the Oldman River. Since hooking damage was so pervasive, I was curious what the probability of hooking damage actually was. If we look at probability of hooking damage in a logistic function, we can see a couple interesting things. One, there's a negligible probability of being hook damaged at around the initial size at maturity, which is 153 millimeters or about 6 inches. And then as fish get larger, that probability becomes much greater. Among the largest of size classes, around 45 centimeters or 18 inches, we see there was a 94% probability of being hook damaged back in 2006 for that size of fish, and an 84% probability between 2018 and 2022 for those largest size classes of fish. We can also see that size at initial hooking damage has apparently shifted about 50 millimeters from one time frame to the other. So that's roughly 200-ish mils in 2006 to around 250 in more recent years. So that's where the sort of the brown part on the chart starts. I'm not sure what the implication is from that, but perhaps it's competition related. But the key thing we observed was that based on Westslope growth curves, specifically from Janowitz 2018, they examined length at age of over 600 Alberta Westslope cutthroat trout. And we determined there could be as many as 8 years of spawning opportunities between the 153 millimeter length at maturity size and the more recent size of hooking damage vulnerability, which is around 250 millimeters, where the brown starts. So basically, fish are susceptible to being angled. They've had several like before fish are susceptible to being angled, they've had several chances to spawn. Um, so our tote data from the tote barge electrofisher came from the main stem, Oldman and Livingston, whereas that growth curve did come from smaller order tributaries across, the whole Westslope range in places where fish tend to be smaller and older. But half of those fish did come from our study area where we do our sampling. So it provides at least one explanation for some of the Westslope resilience to such high angling effort out there. We also did some length and age work back in 2008, which is unpublished. So ACA did this, and we determined overall a bit of a larger length at maturity, which is closer to 200 millimeters for females, in which case we're talking roughly 4 years of spawning opportunities compared to 8. But nonetheless, there looks to be at least some level of recruitment resilience to the angling effort we're seeing up there, regardless of when exactly the fish become mature. So moving forward, we want to continue sampling these main stems and compare the fish condition indices between damaged versus non-damaged fish. And to be clear, there are some very damaged fish in our catches. So much so that since 2021, we've been using an ordinal ranking scale of hooking damage severity to try and quantify the effects on fish condition and health, but we still require continued sampling. Step one is to determine if hooking damage has an impact on fish condition before we can determine how much it actually contributes to incidental angling mortality in a population. You would think that would be straightforward, but not so much. When we're dealing with these data sets that are so highly skewed toward the larger fish, we need to look at some different types of analyses. And so we're going to be looking at that moving forward using different kinds of analysis. So as of today, we're in the middle of another 5-year monitoring interval. And we have reduced, again, our sampling intensity from the previous 5-year time series. This time, it's 4 sites on each of the Oldman and the Livingston rivers. We're going to continue looking at abundance and hooking damage to add to that 7 years we have. We chose to narrow our focus because it's less invasive. We can commit to doing it because costs and demands are less prohibitive. And it's a focused, tangible threats assessment mechanism. So what I mean is that angling is among the key threats to Westslope identified for the Upper Oldman by government managers. And this is understandable given the level of angling and hooking damage that occurs out there. Since the vast majority of that angling occurs on the main stems, we're focusing our relative abundance and hooking damage evaluations on those main stems. It has the most direct link to angling effects and to anglers, which from an ACA perspective is the most important reason, and that's you guys who are the stakeholder. We have a responsibility to conserve both the resource and the angling opportunity. Without the resource, the opportunity disappears. But without the opportunity, the resource could also very well disappear. When proportionately fewer Albertans will care about fishing and fish, who is left to advocate for the value of fisheries and places like we have in the Upper Oldman? And that's you guys. So in summary, if there's any take-home messages from today, here they are. West slopes in the Upper Oldman are important to Albertans, particularly to Alberta anglers, but especially for the persistence of the species in this province. Secondly, angling effort and hooking damage are both high to extreme in the Upper Oldman. The angler counts and the hooking damage rates corroborate this. However, Westslope have demonstrated some level of resilience in spite of this. We don't know for sure why or for how long, but the data suggests catch and release definitely helped, and recruitment relative to size when fish are first vulnerable to angling may also have something to do with it. So we're going to continue to investigate the hooking damage here. And then finally, Monitoring is labor intensive and expensive, but it's necessary if you want to learn anything meaningful about population status or trends. We can't really detect a trend until we approach, say, a decade worth of monitoring. And that's all I have. If you have any questions, feel free to fire away. I'll turn on my camera.
Is it marvelous there now, or what's happening with the Oldman River?
Jason, there was a question about barbless regulations on the Oldman.
No, as far as I know, it's still just regular barbed. I know managers in general look to literature, which is kind of all over the place when it comes to barbed versus unbarbed. Um, Intuitively, it kind of makes sense, but in the literature, it kind of, yeah, it's not that clear cut.
They're fishing up there, and what's the policy about keeping a fish that could potentially not survive being released?
Yeah, I
Jason,
mean, yeah, I heard the question, and yeah, it makes sense, right? I mean, that's I guess an enforcement issue and a management regulation issue, but yeah, I mean, you could see the problem there. If somebody just wants to keep a fish, they can say it was mangled and just keep it, right? Cutthroat are still considered threatened under the Species at Risk Act, and I think first and foremost, you know, conservation is the number one priority. And also, we've seen, I mean, we've recaptured really mangled fish year after year. So there are places that we can call what we're going to catch where. Remember this guy, he's missing this piece or whatever. And they're still doing their thing and presumably spawning every year. So it's kind of hard to really make a call whether or not they're going to survive. Some of those for sure, like if the jaw's broken or something like that, they're probably not going to survive. All I know is I sure wouldn't risk, you know, harvesting a fish based on how it looks like that.
How old do cutthroat get to?
How old do they get?
Yeah.
So like the length at age or the length at age data based on otoliths, they can be up to say 14 max. So or between 12 to 14 is like a really, really old fish. Um, Generally it's less than that. It's usually, 7 or less kind of thing, maturing at around 6, 5, 6, 7. It kind of depends where you catch them in the headwaters. Uh, they're they don't get as big and they're older. And on the main stems, they grow bigger and faster, and they don't likely live as long as those little guys in the headwaters.
so Jason, I've caught lots of mangled fish in the Upper Oldman, and so certainly that is a threat to the population. But there's another imminent threat. I don't know if you can talk about it or not in the mining that's going on there. And recently, I've heard that there's a number of road closures and other mining activity that are going on in the Upper Oldman. Can you comment on that at all?
Yeah, I can comment. Definitely. So Cabin Ridge, that I mentioned earlier, is full of coal leases. So it's been proposed to have coal mines right in between the Old Man and the Livingston. This isn't great, for sure not. It's definitely a contentious issue down here. Well, in the province even, right? And that is definitely a threat. And definitely a reason why we need stakeholders to use their voices um, to prevent things like that. If if this place is so important to so many Albertans, and if their connection to this place is through angling and the fish that are there, um, I think it's sort of up to stakeholders, yeah, to make their voices heard on this.
Right.
I'm not really sure about the closures. I have also heard of like road closures on Dutch Creek and stuff. I'm not really sure if that was in relation to like forest harvest or if it had to do with mining. I kind of feel like it had to do with forest harvest. But yeah, like the maps of coal leases and stuff are available online, and you can see where they exist in the Upper Old Man and Crow's Nest Pass area. I'm not really sure what the status of those are, kind of like where they're headed or what kind of sort of hurdles they've encountered. But um, yeah, I mean the exploration was there. Like we saw the exploration from helicopter and stuff that was going on.
About water temperature and flow rates.
Um, I mean, how has that been? Has it changed or anything?
Correct.
Yeah, so we've monitored water temperature throughout the watershed for a long time. Haven't really seen much of a trend. That's kind of the way it goes with temperature data. Kind of bounces around all over the place. Same thing with flow rates. There's so much natural variability. We haven't been measuring discharge or anything like that. You can look at the Alberta um, watershed website. It tells you all the flows and everything like that. But as far as I can tell, it's a tough thing to sort of pin down whether it's really changed or just fluctuating. We don't really measure it. I can tell you that it impacts our work, our sampling. Typically, when there's a high flow event, it kind of makes us have to postpone our work. Or if it's at low flows and stream temperatures are high, then we also postpone our work so we don't harm the fish.
There's a question from Bill. He said, given the relatively similar environments of the Livingston and Upper Oldman, is there any notable deviation in the biomass or some number of fish times the size?
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So some other analysis that we were working on, generally speaking, yeah, the number of fish in the Old Man is quite a bit higher than in the Livingston. Um, and I kind of speculate that it has something to do with the headwaters of the Old Man. So Oyster Creek and many of the headwaters that are in the very top end of the watershed are key spawning tributaries. And I kind of feel like because of that, the fish of it, it's like juveniles and 1-year-old fish, they typically move downstream only. And I kind of feel like the way that's situated, it kind of supplies the rest of the river with fish. And so they're like pervasive from top to bottom. If you compare that to the Livingston, um, there are fewer fish, but generally larger on average. And I think it has something to do with where they spawn in there too. So a big chunk of them spawn in White Creek, but White Creek is like not that far from the mouth. It's like quite a ways downstream in that watershed. So I kind of feel like potentially what we're seeing there is the source works its way downstream only, pretty much, but then you're seeing more of those fish that can swim upstream, which are the adult size fish. So when you're catching the fish sort of in the higher reaches of the Livingston, they're the ones that are kind of big enough to overcome, upstream velocities and things like that. So generally speaking, there's more juveniles in the Old Man than in the Livingston, and the average size Livingston is a little bit bigger.
Were any of these fish historically stocked into that area? I mean, how many of these are purebred native Westslope cutthroat as opposed to something that's hybridized with something else?
Yeah, I'm not really sure what the stocking history is in terms of cutthroat. I know back in old times, I mean, there was stocking of different strains of Westslope. There was stocking of golden trout. I mean, they kind of stocked fish everywhere, but the stocking record is not very good. From what I know, that hasn't occurred in the Upper Oldman, but I can't say for sure. Um, what I do know is that the fish above the Oldman Falls, the Upper Falls, are pure Westslope, and they are endemic to the Oldman. Beyond that, I don't know.
Okay, thanks. Dean?
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering if the difference between the damage data in around 2006 and then around 2018 had any relationship to the increasing prevalence of fly fishing.
Yeah, so I mean, it stands to reason. We can't say definitively whether or not angling effort increased or not, because comparative data between years is not that comparable. Um, but it kind of stands to reason that if less fish are being harvested because it's catch and release, then there's going to be more of them that have been caught before and having hooking damage, right? So that's just an assumption based on the data.
During your recent population studies, were you conducting any genetic sampling to determine if hybridization was occurring?
Yeah, so yeah, over the years we've collected all sorts of tissue samples. Like even back 2006, we began collecting tissue samples. The way genetics are analyzed has changed a bit, but um, there was produced by GOA. It was called the GDP. It's the genetic delineation product, and basically it maps out all these watersheds with west slopes by color and where the peer populations are, where near peer populations are, or where, and then where they're considered hybrids. Um, and I can't remember what percent purity they call near pure. I think it's between 95% to 99, and then anything that was considered hybrid was basically less than 95% pure, which is a pretty high bar. If you consider Montana, I'm pretty sure they consider that like pure West Slope. Um, so yeah, there has been a lot of work done on, you know, hybridization, where the pure fish are. As it stands now, it's kind of a gradient. So there's those places that were pink on the map, those are genetically pure, and then everything else is either close to pure or considered hybrid.
Any more questions? Jason, thanks very much. It was a very interesting presentation. We learned a lot and learned quite a bit about the damage that's inflicted by the anglers on the fish. I knew there was a lot of damage. I just didn't know how extensive and how long you've been collecting that information. Oh, there's one last question. What actions can we take to ensure the future of your efforts?
Um, yeah, just basically just say how important you think cutthroat are and native trout are. I mean, you know, advocate for native trout, basically. Um, like I said, there are a lot of priorities in Alberta when it comes to fisheries, and there's only so many resources to go around. So yeah, if it's known how important this is to stakeholders, then it's going to, be a priority.
Roy,
Yeah, it's got one question. What was native in the old system?
what was native in the old man system?
Yeah, so like in terms of species, there's bull trout, cutthroat, and mountain whitefish, and that's it. It's yeah, it's not a very diverse, species diversity, but um, yeah, that's the three of them.
Okay, so join me in thanking Jason for being with us tonight. Thank you very much, Jason.